sure to mute yourselves.
Okay.
Please be sure to mute yourselves unless you're in the breakout room participating that way. I'm actually, yeah, okay, I'll leave that like that. People are being really good about muting, so that's great. So we're recording the session. We're not going to record the breakout rooms when we get to that, of course, but we did want to be able to provide the results of this webinar and make them available to other folks, other planners who are interested, so that they could see all the resources that are available and everything. So we are recording. Quick overview of what we're doing this afternoon. So we have Carla Ebenak with us, who has been leading the certificate maintenance credit development for sustainability. We're really glad to have her. She's been doing one heck of a good job doing that. And this is a little bit part of rolling that out to let you folks know about what's going on with that. So she will be talking about that, and Matt, as I mentioned before, will be talking about sustainable resources. Following that, we'll have a discussion about the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Maya Mansfield, who has joined us this afternoon very graciously, will be speaking about that. And then following that, Sally Cox will speak about supporting threatened communities in Alaska. So we've got a little bit of an east-west thing going on this afternoon. We'll do a SWOT analysis to talk a bit about what you guys see as being good resources that are available to planners to do resiliency type of planning, and what you think might be missing from the equation, what we need to work on more and develop more to help you guys out. We'll do that through discussion in breakout rooms, and then reporting back to the group as a whole. These are your presenters this afternoon. So as I mentioned, Carla will speak first. She'll again talk about the CM credit for sustainability. Matt Buchan will be talking about other resources that are available through APA, and especially through the sustainability division currently. Maya Mansfield, again, about the Massachusetts program. We're again really happy to have her with us, as we are also Russell Cox, who very graciously joined us from Alaska this afternoon. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Carla.
Thank you, Jim. And hi, I'm Carla Ebenbach. My section today is a deeper dive into one aspect of what APA is doing related to climate change, sustainability, and resilience, continuing education, and in particular, two education initiatives which will be of interest to AICP certified planners, especially. One is the soon to take effect Sustainability and Resilience Targeted CM credit, and also the upcoming Sustainability and Resilience series. Next slide. These are important developments that can support you as you're asked more and more to create sustainable and resilient plans that account for and address the challenge of extreme weather, sea level rise, and other aspects of a changing climate. As Matt Buchan will speak to more in a moment, APA is engaged in a wide array of climate change work beyond just these two continuing education initiatives, including policy and resource development to support the planning profession. There's a library of policy guides and PAS reports, both existing and in development, as well as a growing knowledge base and APA Learn resource for planners. But with the aid of staff and division leadership, other volunteer leadership, APA is doubling down on its attention to climate change and related issues, and investing effort into more detailed guidance and resources to help planners. But again, Matt will dig into some of that as well. Right now, I'll focus my remarks on the new Sustainability and Resilience CM credit, and the series that's also developing as a result. Next slide. So there's been a shift in the continuing education requirements, or there is going to be a shift rather, for AICP certified planners, with the addition of a new rotating CM requirement for all planners in sustainability and resilience, as well as a new requirement for an equity credit. As you may know, right now, we are all required to earn 3 mandatory credits, credit and a half for each law and ethics. But starting in January of 2022, we will need to complete 4 mandatory credits within our continuing education, and those will be divided up as shown here between law, ethics, equity, and the new targeted CM for sustainability and resilience, for a total of 4. And the idea of the rotating new credit is that it will focus on this subject area for a number of years, and then it will switch to something else. But right now it's considered a subject of great importance to planners. And so AICP is asking us to be educated about it. As I said, it will take effect in January. You don't need to earn the credit now, and you can't log it now. But of course, we hope planners are availing themselves of, far more than just 1 credit hour on this subject and building their skills and knowledge in keeping with the challenge of the work ahead for all of us. Next slide. So the criteria for this new credit, I was the chair of the task force that developed the criteria. The aim was to balance the breadth of the subject area, which is wide, obviously, with instructional objectives that could be identified within a session. So it was designed, the way of screening for the content was conceived kind of as a tent, a flexible space, because the field is of course evolving and will continue to over the lifetime of the credit. So it's a flexible space with further sub areas in it. There are 7 sustainability learning areas, as well as 11 resilience learning areas. And then under that, 12 topics that could be addressed, either, several or one of them, at least in session material. And then there's also factored in requirements for diversity, addressing equity in every presentation, the credentialing of some portion of the panelists, as well as diversity of expertise. We're not just looking for planners to give these presentations. Next slide. So in a moment, I'll put a link to APA's newly published information about the credit in the chat. But building upon this new credit that's coming out next year, a new steering committee formed, which is developing a series of live and recorded learning sessions to roll out over about 2 years free of charge that will help planners earn these credits, but more importantly, fill their knowledge gaps and give them the chance to learn from other professionals engaged in the work inside and outside the planning field. So our aim with this series is to help all planners better understand distinctions between sustainability and resilience and build their working knowledge of what each entails. All the sessions in this series will provide AICP CM credit both live and on demand. So this will be a resource that can be tapped into, into the future. It's led by division volunteers, and it will incorporate, importantly, introductory level sessions as well as intermediate, more roundtable format sessions, so that it can be supportive of planners wherever their entry point is into the subject matter. Next slide. Again, it will take effect after January 2022. So the piece in the background there are the 12 topics that relate to the topics of the criteria. These are the topics generally planned for the series, but the 4 topics that we're going to start with, that we've decided to roll out with, are these 4 shown on the screen. I can see we had a little funny thing happen there with the font, but I can tell you that the extreme weather trends and their impact on community and infrastructure is likely to be the first one, probably at the end of this summer or in the early fall, as we have a really powerful panel lining up. And I just want to say the most inspiring aspect of this series to me is that it will involve a wide array of professionals coming together voluntarily to educate and assist the profession as a whole. It will cross geographic and sector lines and increase knowledge and make our work towards achieving sustainability and resilience, both individually and collectively, more effective. Next slide, I think, is my last slide. So if you'd like any more information on this, if you'd like to get involved in some way, I hope you'll reach out. My email address is there, and that about covers it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carla. Matt, my friend, you are up next.
I'm next. All right. Well, next slide then. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for having us, and thanks to all of you that have gotten on the webinar. We're excited to be here. I think kind of my role in this is to just highlight some of the things, some of the resources that APA and the division have put forth related to climate resources, particularly when we get to those breakout rooms and we ask about, what are the strengths. You can already kind of see some of the things that are out there. I have a feeling that a lot of them you're probably not aware of. But most of them, at least the ones that our division has worked on, are compiled under a resources tab on our website. It's at www.apascd.com. And I'm realizing that the screenshot is actually of our old website. And if you get there under the resources tab, you'll see where a lot of these tools are that I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. But the Sustainable Communities Division has been spending a lot of time. In fact, we've kind of set our strategic directions for the next several years to focus really on 2 or 3 topics. That's the topic of climate change, equity, and resilience. And as part of that, we rebranded our longstanding, what we used to be called the Sustainability Champions Program, and have rebranded and rebooted it as a Climate Champions Program. The whole purpose of this program is to take the the national level discussion on a particular topic, like sustainability, like climate, and tie that to our state chapters who really have no particular topic, but have great geographic representation. So this program pulls together a bunch of key people from across the country to make that connection or facilitate that connection between the national dialogue on a topic and the state-based conversations that happen more regionally. You can see the map of those representatives that we have today. We're always looking for some champions to fill in our network. Jim has actually been one of our champions for years. And as part of that, he was part of a lot of the tools that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of slides, as well as a strategic partnership with the Great Plains Institute. So you'll see their logo on a lot of these as well. Next slide. So one of the first major resources that's out there that's definitely worth checking out was a complete development of a new APA climate change policy guide. What's really cool about this policy guide is that it's developed in a manner which I think is really usable. It does include 50 or over 50 policies which kind of help you frame discussion points and things of that sort. But it's got a couple other neat things too. And the second part is it's actually following those policies are a list of strategies to achieve those policies. So it almost gives you kind of the overarching policy statement and then a whole blueprint of things that you can start implementing and exploring in your communities. It's also organized by if you remember the Comp Plan for Sustaining Places program, divided into 6 categories. There is a 5th for federal, but the purpose of that was it actually made sure that we were addressing climate policy, addressing climate topics holistically and about how we have to think about our communities versus these little individual silos that we always think about. Next slide. The next series of tools are ones that our climate champions have been working on and developing in concert with the Great Plains Institute. Our data collection process guide is something that provides planners with guidance on accessible data collections that are out there, also data collection methodologies that are out there. But these are ones that are associated with climate action. It includes a list of data resources available for communities across the U.S. to use as part of development of their own climate action plan or greenhouse gas inventory. Next slide. Our APA climate development review checklist. This provides planners with an example development review checklist to help identify how climate change considerations can be, better integrated into the development review process, which is really one of those places where this oftentimes falls short. We talk about it in plans, we talk about it in policy, and then when the rubber meets the road, getting it on the ground, we seem to forget about it. So it's a valuable tool for putting forward the community's greenhouse gas reduction targets, their energy goals, but really connects that to developers and builders to make sure that we're considering these things as part of the built environment in our infrastructure. Next slide. Our climate ordinance summary. This provides planners with a searchable database of both model and adopted ordinance language from across the country, all ones that are related to advancing climate action as part of private land development. It also allows filtering by jurisdiction type, population size, and sectors of the economy. So you can search by, land use for renewable energy, things of that sort. And then when you get into specifics of it, it talks about summaries, example language, and then actual links to the ordinances that are out there. So it's a pretty cool tool to be used by our communities out there. You can either use it to benchmark how your regulations are formatted, or you could just use it to kind of as example language to pull into your own regulations. And then my final slide, please. This is the pending update to the new climate change PAS report or Planner Advisory Service. This will be a comprehensive update, almost like a complete overhaul and replacement to the one way back in 2010, just focused on kind of the introduction to climate and energy. This one is being led by division leadership, and it goes into just like a comprehensive in-depth look on climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and then starts to introduce the topic of climate resilience, and it is slated for tentative publication in September. Be happy to answer questions down the road. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Matt. Really great presentation. So we've now gathered a little bit of information, some really good information about the sorts of tools there are that are out there. We wanted to take also a few minutes here to showcase a couple of programs, a couple of initiatives that have been very effective in addressing climate change over the course of recent years. And to that end, our first program presenter will be Maya Mansfield. Maya.
Thank you. Thanks so much for including me today. My name is Maya Mansfield. I'm the Director of Climate Adaptation and Resilience at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview on some of our key initiatives that are underway in the adaptation and resiliency space. Next slide. So just some context around the mandate for this work in Massachusetts. We had an executive order in 2016 signed by Governor Baker mandating a comprehensive approach to reducing greenhouse gases and preparing for the impacts of climate change across state government. This mandated our state adaptation plan, our municipal support program, and then a subsequent environmental bond bill codified most of those components and authorized a significant amount of money towards climate change. Next slide. I just wanted to flag here, this is not an effort that I directly work on, but others on my team related to Massachusetts 2050 decarbonization roadmap. This was a report that came out at the end of last year and examined the pathways and scenarios for Massachusetts to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So this is a really important document for our office and guiding our efforts, especially over the next decade. And this is online if you want to take a look. Next slide, please. And so the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan released in 2018 is what's really guiding a lot of our adaptation and resiliency efforts in Massachusetts. We implement this plan through the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, that's our internal interagency task force, and then through our local partnerships and our funding and technical assistance to municipalities via the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness or MVP grant program. Next, please. So first I'll start with MVP. This is our funding and technical assistance program to help municipalities plan for and implement priority resilience projects. Next. The MVP program is currently engaging 89% of the municipalities across Massachusetts. That's 312 communities. And we've awarded over $44 million to date to these communities to engage in preliminary planning exercises and then implement priority on the ground planning, design, and construction projects. Next, please. The planning side of the MVP program has helped us to identify the top hazards, vulnerabilities, and actions that municipalities are identifying across the state. Next slide. And it's also helping us to move the implementation work in Massachusetts forward around these core principles that the program has related to projects that provide multiple benefits across a community, engage community members in a robust and meaningful way. They identify proactive solutions supported by our statewide climate data. They prioritize nature-based solutions and improving outcomes for environmental justice communities, and they're innovative and transferable. So these are elements that we're looking for across all projects that we fund. Next slide. So we fund projects across these three major categories: planning, assessments, capacity building, regulatory updates. A lot falls under that umbrella, but then hope to be moving projects up this timeline through design and permitting and ultimately construction and implementation. Next slide. And so here I'll just run through a few projects that we've supported in the last few years that we're particularly proud of or interested in. Here, this is a project in Western Massachusetts among more rural communities looking at the resiliency of dirt roads and conducted a significant amount of community outreach on the topic. Next, please. The City of Boston developed its first ever resilient building design guidelines that it's been implementing across the city. Next slide. A town in southeastern Massachusetts purchased a significant amount of land for conservation in particularly climate vulnerable areas. Next slide. And a town in the greater Boston area was working to develop a resilient public waterfront park, and this project was rooted in a really strong coalition of community leaders and in a community-based planning and design process that has won a lot of interesting awards. Next slide. So I wanted to just mention our website, resilientma.org/MVP, where we've developed a series of toolkits to help all of our projects sort of move forward and advance according to the program's core principles around nature-based solutions, environmental justice and equity, engagement, and an additional toolkit on health and healthcare. We have a map that shows all the grants that have funded and what the projects are about. And we're continuously updating this website with new resources and expect to announce our newest round of grant awards later this summer. Next slide. So now I'll cover the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team and a key project that we've launched in the last couple of months. So as I mentioned, this is the interagency task force that's working to implement our state hazard mitigation climate adaptation plan. And next slide, please. And this is the project that we've been, that we just launched over Earth Week in April. It was an interactive web-based tool that automated the state's available climate change data and provided capital projects a preliminary climate risk screening and planning recommendations. This was a project that was advancing some of the core priority actions within the state plan, notably to increase our focus on resiliency in our capital planning process and develop more consistent standards across agencies. And so we wanted to create an easy to use tool where both agencies and municipalities could input project information and very quickly get a sense of the climate exposure and risk at that project site and get some preliminary recommendations for design. Next slide, please. This tool is live on our website, resilientma.org, and you can go in and set up a login and test it out. All the data is from Massachusetts, so focus your projects there. But some of the ways we're recommending our agencies and municipalities utilize this tool is to improve their state grant applications and justify how they're using climate data in their project, their awareness of climate risks, how they're incorporating adaptation strategies into the design of the project. Considerations of project sites for projects and being able to compare climate exposure across multiple sites. Incorporating the recommended design standards into early project planning and design phases or in procurement documents. And capital planning, being able to identify whether major state investments are increasing our climate exposure and vulnerability, and really identifying the projects that we want to push further to consider either alternative locations or increased resiliency standards. Next slide, please. On the website, there is a user guide and a 20-minute training video where you can get a lot more information around how this tool works. Next slide. And just a couple slides on what it looks like. It's about going in, drawing a polygon around your specific project site, saving that polygon. That immediately queries all of the state's GIS climate layers that we have loaded into the tool. Next slide, please. And then you go through a series of steps to input information about the project around the ecosystem services benefits that the project will provide, around additional questions around the climate exposure and history of events on the site, questions related to the specific assets on the site and the social and economic and broader environmental impact of the project site, and what would happen if the project was inoperable or not functioning due to a natural hazard event. And then from there, you go to review your outputs immediately. That's the next slide. And so the tool gives you a ecosystem service benefit score that rates responses to those initial questions. It provides a climate exposure rating and additional exposure details as to the site's exposure to sea level rise, extreme precipitation, and extreme heat. And then a climate risk rating, which brings together the exposure rating plus the answers to the project impact questions to assess climate risk for the project and provide additional details on why it received that rating. And these ratings are meant to be used by project reviewers or capital planning staff to assess, again, these higher exposure, higher risk projects, and making sure that we're really considering resiliency and conducting the additional analysis that's needed, and that we're able to flag those projects. Next slide, please. And then here are what the standards look like that are recommended. So for each climate hazard, we have a recommended planning horizon, a recommended intermediate horizon sometimes, a return period, applicable design criteria, those are the green check marks for the project, and then a recommended methodology that you would click here and download for identifying those design criteria for the project. Next slide, please. We then have a project report that summarizes all the information that the tool captures and that we've asked applicants to attach to state grant applications for state-funded infrastructure or other capital projects, and then additional documents and resources in the tool around implementing climate resiliency on projects and additional questions to guide decision-making, guide and document decision-making around site suitability, regional coordination, and flexible adaptation pathways. I just wanted to mention the Weston and Sampson and VSC group teams that we've worked with over the past couple of years to develop this tool, and then all of the agency and external stakeholders as well. This tool is out in beta form, and so we have a survey that's on our website. When you go to access the tool, there's the link right there. So feel free to go in, set up a login, test it out, and share any feedback. We're actively looking for feedback as we work to improve this resource. And I think that might be the last slide. Let's check. Yes, so unfortunately I have to hop off in a few minutes, but feel free to email me if you have any further questions or anything you'd like to follow up with. So thank you, Jim. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate you, and we all do really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about these programs today. Massachusetts has some really great things going on, and you're obviously a huge part of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for our next presenter, we have Sally Russell Cox, who will be talking about the Alaska Coastal Resilience Partnership. Sally, you are up. We're really looking forward to hearing about the program.
Thanks very much, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
So hi, everyone. My name is Sally Russell Cox, and I work for the State of Alaska Division of Community and Regional Affairs, and I manage the division's community resilience programs. I've been working with rural Alaska communities, primarily Alaska Native villages, on ways to adapt to environmental threats such as erosion, flooding, and thawing permafrost for about 15 years, actually a little longer than 15 years. And during this time, I've managed several programs which specifically deal with climate impacts to small communities. While I can't cover it all today, I'd like to provide you with some of the highlights of a new partnership I'm involved with. Next slide. So, first of all, I'd like to provide some background on the communities that I'm working with who are specifically rural. 66% of all federally recognized tribes are in Alaska, most based in rural Alaska communities. The average population in a rural Alaskan community is less than 500 people. Most rural communities are accessible only by plane and boat, not by road. Most are engaged in subsistence activities that provide nearly all their food needs. 144 Indigenous rural communities are at risk to some degree of infrastructure damage from erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw. And 95% of those 144 communities are small and low income. Fuel is extremely expensive in rural Alaska. In some communities, it's as high as $10 per gallon. Next slide. So among the communities that I work with, there's great diversity. Diversity across cultures, languages, lifeways, worldviews, art forms, and histories. There are 11 distinct Indigenous cultures in Alaska that can be described geographically, shown here on this map. And among those 11 cultures, there are at least 20 native languages. Most Alaska Native communities are tribally based, and many of these tribal groups were nomadic prior to settling in Alaska Native villages as we know them today. Next slide. So a number of climate trends are impacting Alaskan communities. Alaska is warming twice as fast as the national average. Rising air temperatures lead to permafrost thaw and the loss of sea ice. A loss of barrier sea ice makes communities more vulnerable to the impacts of sea storms because they lose that barrier to storms. Increased wind speeds amplify the impact of storms. Increased precipitation leads to flooding and erosion. And rising sea level contributes to coastal erosion and flooding. Next slide. And I'm going to show you some real life examples of the impacts of those trends on Alaskan communities. This is of ice jam flooding in the village of Galena. Next slide. This is of erosion in the village of Newtok, which I've worked extensively with over the years. The large photo was taken during my first trip to Newtok in the summer of 2006. The inset photo was taken in the summer of 2019, 13 years later. Note the amount of land that's been lost to erosion. Next slide. And this is of the cemetery in Congiganak, which has been turned into a swamp by thawing permafrost. And this is just one of the impacts to local cultures. This has led to graves sinking into the water and the community having to move graves to higher ground. Next. So there are significant challenges to development in rural Alaska. About 60% of Alaska's communities are not connected by roads, and there are vast distances between villages, which leads to high transportation costs. Limited local resources for community development projects and the harsh temperatures of remote Alaska contribute to these costs and challenges. The technical expertise needed, a lack of redundant infrastructure systems, and limited communication infrastructure all make these communities more vulnerable. Next. Environmental threats to infrastructure can exacerbate existing stressors faced by communities, such as overcrowding, lack of housing, access to clean water, increased accidents and injuries, food insecurity, and decreased mental health. Next. So how many communities does this affect in Alaska? Environmental threats to community viability is a growing concern. In 2019, a statewide threat assessment was completed, which assessed threats to infrastructure from erosion, flooding, and thawing permafrost in 186 rural Alaskan communities. 144, or 77% of those communities, were identified as being at risk to some degree of infrastructure damage from environmental threats. And this map shows the location of those communities. Next. Of these communities, 66 were threatened to some extent by erosion, with 31% highly threatened by erosion. Next. 66% were threatened to some extent by flooding, with 41% highly threatened by flooding. Next slide. 61% were threatened to some extent by permafrost thaw, with 39% highly threatened by permafrost thaw. Next slide. Alaskan communities are responding to environmental threats in several ways that, for planning purposes, can be grouped into three primary categories. Protection in place is the use of shoreline protection measures and other controls to prevent or minimize impacts, allowing the community to remain in its current location. Managed retreat involves moving part of the community away from hazard-prone areas to locations in or adjacent to the community. And relocation involves moving the entire community to an entirely different location, not connected to the current site. And this is considered the option of last resort. But it's not unusual for communities to combine these different approaches. Next slide. So I'm going to show you some examples of these adaptation measures in Alaska Native villages. This is a rock revetment built to protect the village of Kivalina, which is on a barrier island and considering moving. Next slide. This is a managed retreat in the village of Napakiak. The community is moving infrastructure away from the eroding riverbank in the foreground to higher ground. Next slide. And this is the village of Newtock's relocation site on Nelson Island, where 1/3 of the population has already relocated. Next. The adaptation process can be described in three phases illustrated here. Each phase builds upon the other. The first is the data collection and risk assessment phase, which results in the community's understanding of risk, critical for the next phase, planning and decision-making. This phase really is foundational to inform decision-making. During the planning phase, decisions are made about preferred solutions and actions, and strategies are developed for local actions to reduce risk. And then the final phase is implementation, when the community actually carries out the preferred solutions or actions. This phase goes beyond studies and planning to actually constructing solutions. And I need to add that it's really important for the community to be the driver of the decisions for each of these phases, which is why that first phase is so important for them to truly understand what the environmental impacts are for the present and for the future to their community. So next slide. With this in mind, I'd like to talk about a new partnership in Alaska that focuses on supporting communities as they work their way through the adaptation process. The Alaska Coastal Resilience Partnership brings together two State of Alaska agencies and Alaska's largest nonprofit health organization. That is the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys Coastal Hazards Program, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium Center for Environmentally Threatened Communities, and my agency, the Alaska Division of Community and Regional Affairs Community Resilience Programs. Next slide. So historic shoreline change maps will be developed to inform communities of areas where erosion rates are the greatest. Next slide. Erosion forecasts will be developed from historical erosion data. Next. And erosion forecast maps will be developed along with erosion impact maps to inform long-term planning. Next. Coastal flood impact maps will be developed, which will be color-coded to inform the community of the impact to community buildings and infrastructure during different types of flood events. Next. And this will inform planning for critical infrastructure within the community. Next slide. During the community planning and technical assistance phase, we'll be working in depth with 14 of the most environmentally threatened communities to support them through the 3 adaptation phases. Next slide. After the community-specific data collection and risk assessments are completed, I'll travel to these communities with a multidisciplinary team to meet with community leadership to discuss the erosion and flood risk assessments that were developed. We'll provide support to each community on interpreting the hazard data and on community decisions such as, can we continue to live here? And if yes, what are the adaptation options we have to continue to live here? One of the resources I have to bring to this project is a FEMA-funded program, the Risk Mapping Assessment and Planning Program, also known as RISMAP. RISMAP strives to increase community resilience by providing communities with quality data and risk assessment tools. And FEMA Region 10 is very interested in providing support to the communities we'll be working with. So we'll identify any gaps in data and risk assessments that the RISMAP program can assist with. Next slide. The team will support the community on assessing adaptation alternatives and developing adaptation strategy goals, objectives, and milestones. A written plan will be developed to document the community's specific adaptation strategy. The plan implementation section will include specific projects the community can pursue in the future, including project scope, schedule, and budget. Developing these projects will answer questions such as, is there land suitable for development to which the structures can be placed? What permits are required for the project? How much will it cost to hire a contractor to complete the project? Will shoreline protection be an effective solution? And if yes, is there a potential local material source? Next slide. The team will support the communities in developing grant applications to secure funding for the selected adaptation efforts. This will involve completing benefit cost analyses, working with communities and tribal attorneys to develop required policies and procedures, and competitively selecting contractors by a methodology that meets or exceeds federal requirements. So that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to the remainder of this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. It was really interesting, and I know it was valuable for the audience. So we really appreciate you traveling even virtually all the way from Alaska down here to help us out. And this is Sally's contact information, and I'm sure she would be available to ask questions or address issues that you might want to bring up. We're now going to move on to the part of this webinar where you all get to tell us what you think about what's going on. We're going to do breakout rooms where we're going to do a SWOT analysis. I think probably most folks on this webinar have participated in something like a SWOT analysis, if not actually a SWOT analysis. We're going to do this in breakout rooms. There are going to be 3 breakout rooms, and then there will be the main lobby. It's been my experience with breakout rooms that there are sometimes people that for whatever on teams get left behind in the main lobby. And if that happens here, which probably will, I'll hang out in the main lobby and we'll do a SWOT analysis there too. Following the SWOT analysis, we'll get back together as a group and talk about what we've heard and what's been talked about in each of the breakout rooms. So when you're doing a SWOT analysis, there are 4 areas that you're interested in: strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. That accounts for the acronym SWOT. When you're thinking about strengths and weaknesses, those are things that are maybe internal to the issue that you're analyzing. And when you're talking about opportunities and threats, those are resources or concerns that come from outside the area that you're working on, things that you have less control over. So strengths and weaknesses, you have control over, you can do something about. Opportunities and threats, you may be able to do something about them, but you're not directly in control of those issues. So let's take a look at an example. Oh, first did we lose the example? No, we got slides out of place here. Sorry about that. I do want to mention that our facilitators this afternoon are going to include Matt Buchan, Carla Ebenbach, and Fiona Coughlin and myself. Here's the example. So this is obviously a made-up example. It's my backyard. Strengths in my backyard are the beautiful gardens that we have. My wife is an awesome gardener, and so we have beautiful gardens in our backyard. A weakness that we have is that we have an old play structure that's kind of falling apart. So that presents a certain amount of liability and danger. So that might represent a weakness. Opportunity is something from outside, again, something external. In this case, it's my brother. He said he'd help me build a shed. So it'd be really nice to include in my backyard. It's not something that I'm doing directly myself, except maybe with my brother. I'll bring him iced tea. And threats. Well, you know, it's kind of a climate change thing. We could have really heavy winds, could have really heavy storms like tornadoes, and that would obviously be a threat. It's nothing that I can control. I don't know when the tornado is coming or if it's coming, but I can prepare for it. So that's an example of a threat. So today, what we want to talk about, of course, is our existing climate change programs. So current APA support for resilience planning. Want to analyze the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats associated with that. Again, we're going to send you all the breakout rooms. You'll have 25 minutes in the breakout rooms. I will try and get a warning out at about 20 minutes to let you know that the breakout rooms are closing. Then once the breakout rooms have closed, we will come back and we'll talk about what we learned in the breakout rooms. A little bit of a heads up here. We're looking for volunteers who might want to help present back the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we learned about in each of the breakout rooms. So the facilitators are probably going to ask if you might be available to do that. If you feel so inclined, please, raise your hand, speak up. We're interested in participation. Again, we really like to hear from all of you. So with that in mind, I'm going to send us all to breakout rooms now. Hopefully the technology will work the way it is supposed to. And so we start. One of the great things about this is that we get to wait a little while we find out whether the technology works or not, because it's lagging. But you should all get a warning in just a moment that says you'll be heading to a breakout room. And there we all go.
So,
Hi, Joanna, you should be heading off shortly. And Bethany, let me see. Can you actually hear me, or are you signed in duplicate by any chance?